Ja, kvällens ämne är finanssystemet en bluff. Jag har några frågor här som jag tänkte bara slänga ut som jag tror att vi kan få svar på ikväll, som också kanske folk ställer sig lite sådär till vardags. Är banker egentligen som alla andra företag? De säger ju det ibland. Vi är bara som ICA eller något annat. Och är de helt missförstådda? Är det handlar om? Eller är det någonting annat? Den frågan tror jag vi kan få svar på idag. Är din bankkontakt en kompis i finansdjungeln eller en bonushungrig person med empatistörning? Det tror jag också vi kan få svar på ikväll. Ni som är här kanske har er åsikt klar i den frågan, men ändå, vi får svar. Eller den enkla frågan, kan jag lita på min bank? Också en intressant fråga. Det tror jag också vi kan få svar på här idag. Som ni redan hörde, Joris Luijendijk, something like that. Det är nästan lika svårt att uttala Joris efternamn som det är att få ett rakt besked om vad boräntan är, faktiskt. Har jag märkt. Andreas Cervenka då, förstås, kollega till mig på Svenska Dagbladet som skrivit böcker och skriver mycket om banker. Okej. You guys. Just det, vi tar diskussionen på engelska. Så är det bara. Mest för att jag inte talar holländska. Ja. The timing is very great, isn't it, for this discussion?
It's excellent.
Couldn't have been better. Can you? We've all, most of us, I presume, have followed the debate in the Swedish media about the Mossack Fonseca, the Panama documents or Panama Papers. Can you just briefly tell us about how this has been described in the UK?
Well, I think what has happened is the same essentially as what happened after the crash in 2008, is that very soon it is personalized. And so it's now very much focused on David Cameron and whether his father set up a trust in Panama and for what reasons, and whether he should resign or apologize. And so rather look at the structure behind it.
Okay.
We're turning it into a Putin thing, a Cameron thing, but it's very big and it will have lots of consequences. I mean, there's the Brexit debate coming, and this is fatally undermines, I think, his integrity and his judgment.
Okay.
So this is very big. It's exactly what, if you write a book, after about 9 months, you need a big scandal that confirms the main points in your book.
So you're behind it.
I had a book about Islam in March 2001.
Oh.
I told my wife, it's not selling, we need something big.
Oh. So what's your next book about? That's very
Yeah.
interesting, isn't it?
The end of Sweden.
Right. Oh, that's terrible. But can you also, do you think that the discussion in the UK, will it turn towards the bank more in a week or 2 or 3?
You mean a turn in the favor of the banks, or are people going to focus on the banks?
Yes. No, more
yes,
focused
and
on
on the more than the banks, more broadly, just the entire offshore industry, because accountants, consultants, lawyers of all sorts. It's a huge industry, and actually, it's one of the reasons that the UK still isn't broke, is that sector makes so much money, because that sucks a lot of capital into the UK, because the UK always, has a trade deficit. And so I think it's, again, with all the other scandals, London doesn't want to be seen as the center of legal or illegal wrongdoing, but they have to do something. And then there's a Guardian, their own newspaper, fanning the flames.
Okay.
It's really awkward for the Brits. So it's lovely if you're not British.
But are they mad? Are people mad at the banks?
I think there's broadly a sort of scandal fatigue. There's been so many scandals, and I was thinking, can we have something that surpasses what we've had before, the Libor scandal, the FX scandal, the PPI scandal? So I thought either something with perversion, sexual perversion, or some sort of that always works really well, or some qualitatively bigger thing. And this is the qualitatively bigger thing, because mind you, the Mossack Fonseca thing is the third or the fourth firm in the world by size. So there are 3 more that are even bigger. Now, what names are hidden in their files?
Right. We'll talk about that a bit more later, and also about your book, where you interviewed hundreds of bankers in London.
Yeah, some of them involved in exactly this.
Okay, interesting. Okay, Andreas, what is your description of the debate so far in Sweden?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of anger, and I notice in my emails I get, and I've been writing about banks for many years, and it's been a lot of scandals. But there's a feeling of enough is enough, and it's like it's quite quite a feat to be able to have so low expectations and still make people disappointed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of that's not bad.
Well done.
So I think there's a feeling like, oh, we all knew this was going on. We knew it was bad, but it was much worse than we even could imagine. As you said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And that's, I think, makes you feel, okay, the system may be corrupt. It's not something you just write about or something you see in a movie. It may be corrupt. And that, I think that, there's a feeling that, okay, enough is enough.
And by corrupt, you mean?
Corrupt, I mean that you have a system that sort of tells you, we're your best friend, we're going to help you, we're good for society, and then, doing the exact opposite.
Okay.
And, it doesn't matter how many scandals you have, it's still going on. They don't care, nothing happens. And I mean, that's going to make people mad.
There's been a lot of talk in the UK about people, Prime Minister. In Sweden, there's been more focus on one bank. This is Nordea. How have they so far handled the situation, do you think?
Not so great. I think the problem is, they had a press conference the other day, and they said things like, oh, we take this very seriously.
That's always a sign.
Yeah. Oh, we're very upset. Oh, I'm so disappointed. But then, oh, well, we haven't done anything wrong, really. We just follow the rules and regulations. So why are you disappointed?
Right.
On who are you disappointed? And the chairman went out, Björn Wahlroos went out and said, well, we follow all the rules and regulations. And then, the question whether you should be doing this, well, that's another matter. Well, hey, maybe that's the thing that really matters. That people don't think you should be doing this in the first place. And I think one of the great things about your book is you showed how our banks are set up. Like they're in silos. They're operating, independent of each other. And Nordea has a department here in Stockholm who works with ethical asset management.
Right.
Working hard to make companies behave more ethically, even demanding policies on tax. And then another department in Nordea is helping people evade tax. Now, I mean, that's bizarre.
So maybe these Nordea funds, they can't invest in Nordea anymore because...
Well, if they're going to follow the policy, that's a very good question. Probably not. Probably have to sell their shares. Yeah.
There's also a question about specifically Nordea then. Do you think they underestimated the reaction? Because I've written a lot about banks and about wrongdoings and fake funds and mortgages being raised without no reason, just to make more money out of your clients. But this time, people seem to be more angry than before. What is the thing in this story that makes people so mad?
I think the hypocrisy, and this is not only the first scandal. I mean, there was a few years ago during the Euro crisis, they figured that the best investment right now is to buy our CEO a flat in Stockholm for 22 million crowns when they were firing thousands of employees. And when they had questions about this, the chairman said, well, a man has to live. And 240 square meters may be much for a journalist, but hey, he's a big banker, and that made people quite mad too. So what happened was, and it was trending on Twitter, was like Nordea was suddenly and customers were leaving and employees were mad. Right. So what happened was they had to totally reverse, and the CEO had to go around all the branches and say I'm sorry. So I think they did underestimate the anger, both from the customers and also from the employees.
Joris, what do you think? Is this a bank crisis we're seeing now in the aftermath of the Mossack Fonseca story?
I think it also taps into this idea that globalization has given us this post-national elite, both individuals and corporations, that are just no longer playing by the rules of a world they do control. And so that there are really now two categories of people. You've got the people who pay their taxes and are part of one particular country, right. And then there are the others. And the others are usually hidden from view. That's the sort of the Davos crowd. That is the public face. But we now get a glimpse of what is underneath that.
Okay.
And if you
We're not supposed to see it, are we, really?
I think that this is, for example, the whole hedge fund world. They hire publicists not to be visible in the media, but to be entirely invisible. So you Google their names and there's nothing. They pay companies to be invisible.
Okay.
And so I think it's the behavior of banks and the consultants and those sort of things, but it's also who they're working for. These corporations that have been avoiding tax in all sorts of ways. And so there's I think this growing disenchantment with and it's called now the elites. And politicians, I think, are more and more seen as individuals trying to use their political career as a springboard into that top layer. And Tony Blair is the best example, a former Social Democrat Labour leader, now taking $2.5 million a year from JP Morgan as an advisor.
Okay. One of the big banks?
One of the big banks. And I think there's Holland, there a number of examples of politicians who were meant to regulate the financial sector, did not, and ended up with a really nice job in the financial sector. And I think this country also has a few examples.
Well, yes, very recently, I mean, the minister responsible for watching and regulating the banks just was elected on the board of Swedbank.
Welcome.
And his closest right hand at the department just was elected head of the Financial Authority. And
so they all know each other, basically.
Yeah, and the head of the bank lobby organization, he was also, from working for the government. So that leaves quite a bad taste in the mouth, I think.
Yeah, so democracy is a system where you have these separation of powers and they're countervailing. But more and more it looks like the people staffing these functions, they're going in a merry-go-round, and they end up all of them very rich, irrespective of their achievement. So you can be the regulator in the UK up until 2007, meaning you've utterly, totally failed. And you end up with a fantastic plum job at RBS, a bank that had to be saved because of your incompetence. Okay. And there are so many examples of this. And you just wait for the anger to boil over into a political movement. I think that the absence of a political movement is really interesting.
How could this be brought into a political movement then, do you think?
Well, I want to, at least in the UK, it's so clear that because they are the only, I think, European country right now where the mainstream Social Democratic Party is led by someone who's truly a leftist, Corbyn.
Right.
The problem is that the entire media establishment is to the right of him, even The Guardian. Okay. And so he has no friends. He has nobody. At some point he now polled for a while better than Cameron. That just didn't make the news. And so it seems that the complicity between politics and the world of finance has also infected the world of journalism. There are very few hard left, credible, accessible, popular spokesmen across Northern Europe who are welcome in popular programs, for example.
So like Mr. Corbyn, for example. He's rarely seen, is he?
Well, you'd want a number of people to do his work for him in the media. Right. Columnists, commentators. There's very little of that. Okay. Also because, and that's what unites Corbyn with Le Pen and with Wilders. Corbyn will never work for Goldman Sachs. But many of the journalists currently working in politics, they are quite likely at some point to move over to the other side and go work for a big corporation.
But is this a... You would think, though, that if there's a strong public movement against the financial sector, then the political parties would pick that up. Because they want to have voters.
But people are quite schizophrenic in that sense. It is the same with sustainability. You poll them and they all say, yes, we want a better environment. Right. And then you look at their behavior in the supermarket and they all buy the bad chicken and the bad... And it's the same here. We can really not be sure whether in 6 months' time there's anything left of the current outrage, because we will have a terrorist attack in a few weeks, and then we'll have a terrible pharmaceutical scandal, and then we'll have the Eurovision Song Contest. But we are sure that in a year's time, the banking lobby is still there.
Right. What do you think, Andreas? Is this somehow will this spill into politics? The aversion against banks? Or?
Well, interestingly enough. I mean, this is nothing really new. Banking crisis and low confidence against banks. Every crisis has a backlash against banks. And there were some German researchers actually who compared, for the last 140 years, banking crisis, and not like ordinary recessions, specifically banking crisis. What happened to politics afterwards? So it was a very clear pattern that you had right-wing movements, you had parliaments that would split it up in smaller and much more difficult to govern the countries. And if you look around the world, what do you see? You see right-wing movements, you see splittered parliaments, difficult to govern.
Really? Okay.
So this is like, in a way, business as usual. What is new is that the whole scale is much bigger because the world has been financialized in a dramatic way the last 30, 40 years. Dramatically.
How do you mean?
Well, the sizes of the banks compared to the economy, the power of the banks, I mean, it's never been this powerful, I would say, in history. And in our lives as well. So in a way, it's much worse than it was. And I mean, I think it's easy when you talk about crisis, you expect like, oh, the ATM is going to close down. It's like a movie, but it doesn't happen that way. It goes slowly. So this is what we see. It's actually just, I think, an effect of what happened in 2008. It's a movie when you're shown one screen every week.
Okay.
It doesn't feel so dramatic when you're doing it, but it's actually quite dramatic.
It would seem, or it could be, it seems, a democratic problem if you have politicians worrying about what the banks think of them. If they want a bank career afterwards.
Yeah.
That's not very good, is it?
No, the question is, are you a country with a financial sector, or are you a financial sector with a country?
Yes.
They say the same thing about Pakistan. Pakistan is not a country with an army, it's an army with a country.
Okay.
And indeed, what you see is in every European country now, there are a couple of banks, and they control the market. They don't compete on price. Otherwise, their salaries would go down, and they never go down. And that creates, if you have an oligopoly, it creates extra profits that you otherwise wouldn't have. And so they use these profits for bonuses, but also for their lobby and for lots of sponsoring. There's immense degree of complicity right now in capitals across Europe, where you realize that actually many of those museums, parks, without the banks and their sponsorship, they wouldn't be there. And some of it also goes to very nice speaking fees. Hillary Clinton gets $200,000 for a speech at Goldman Sachs, and she does a couple of them. I mean, that's nice work if you can get it.
How much do they pay you?
Goldman Sachs, I would give it away, but even then,
they don't ask you, do they?
Not 200,000. Oh no, but they're very kind. I mean, all the banks. I'm originally from Holland, and there the book did very well. And I'm being invited by all these banks. The degree of repressive tolerance, and we're open. We're an open organization. I'm sure you constantly get invited to share your views, and you're being thanked effusively. And in the corridors, they ask you, do you always want to become a journalist, or stay a journalist, or are you perhaps thinking of some other challenges later on? And
but what do they say when you say that the Netherlands is a financial sector with the country? What do they say? They just nod and smile.
Yeah, and they say, wow, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I think I'm really struck by just how unworried the banks really are. And how they think, well, we'll just
how do you see this?
Sit out the storm.
How do you see that they are not worried?
Because I don't think they see any meaningful political process or program on the horizon to fundamentally break up their power. And so it already starts with the confusion of immoral and amoral. So we're very angry at the banks, but what are we really angry at? Are we angry at them breaking the law? Or are we angry at the fact that the laws are so bad that they don't even have to break them? Yeah. And if we tend constantly to personalize it and to think the problem is the wolf of Wall Street. Now, coke snorting, whoring, gambling addicted psychopaths who will sell you shares and that don't exist. And that's what the audience loves. Everybody goes to see Wolf of Wall Street. Nobody goes to see Margin Call, which is a far better, really accurate portrayal of a bank. And here too, I think I worry about the focus going to shift on the illegal bit and not about the legal stuff. And fortunately, Obama has come out and said, the real problem, folks, is that much of this stuff is legal. But if it's legal, so it requires a global legislative response. Now, we don't have a world government. I don't want a world government. But we have a global economy now. And I think in that mismatch, the banks feel very safe.
Andreas, the banks, from this discussion, the banks, they claim always that we're just like any other company.
Well,
but
that's
is
just
this really
not true.
No.
I mean, banks are very special in the way that just take the fact that banks, we literally outsourced everything that has to do with money and payment systems. Okay, so banks create, for example, 97% of all the money that circulates. That's quite a big influence, and also they take care of all the payments. So I mean that alone tells you that these are not ordinary companies. But I very much agree that I think one problem is that regulators and politicians have been very, very naive when it comes to banks. And take, for example, the Libor scandal, which was huge in scale. It all boiled down to the fact that the system was set up so a number of traders, not too many, was reporting numbers on the rates, and it all was reliant on them being honest. Okay. That's like leaving 10 alcoholics in a bar and like, oh, promise not to touch anything, okay? It didn't work out.
No.
So it was very easy. I mean, you don't rob a bank, you own a bank. I mean, that's how it works. And in Sweden, for example, just now we have one of the most important issues after the crisis has been capital. Banks need more capital, but then they said, okay, you can calculate yourselves how much capital you need. Well, how did that turn out? Then just the other week they said, oh, we're very disappointed because they've gamed the system.
Right.
I mean, I mean, they've been very weak.
But why? But if you compare the power of the government in a national government and to the banks, for example, in Sweden and in Holland, where both very strong financial sectors, so are the politicians afraid of regulating too much? Are they afraid to be too hard on the banks because?
Well, definitely. I mean, the whole lesson from Lehman was like, don't touch the banks, don't play by the rules, and everything goes wrong. I mean, what was done after Lehman was never about the moral thing or the right thing. It was like, just how do we avoid the total meltdown?
Right.
And that's because we are taken hostage by the financial system. I mean, if you would be just to do the right thing, then it would be quite easy. Very easy. Do this, break up the banks, do that. But it's not that easy. It's very complex because the consequences are huge.
And they always claim also the banks that if you break up the banks into smaller banks, very many small banks, it'll be much more expensive for the customers, and you won't get a system that works smoothly. Is this all nonsense?
Yes. I mean, according to that argument, oligopoly is better than the free market, because an oligopoly is a limited number of players who divide the market among themselves. And this is one of those delectable little contradictions that in the heart of the free market system, you do not have the free market. So imagine that a restaurant would sell the sort of toxic crap that the bank sold until 2008, all the while paying their cooks and their waiters the sort of salaries that bankers were getting. Now, according to free market theory, when all of this, as people discover how toxic the stuff is, you'll see two things. One is that these restaurants close, and two is that lots of new restaurants appear, because people will think, wow, you can make so much money being a waiter or a cook, I'm going to start a restaurant, and so prices in the restaurants will actually come down. That's what competition does. Competition exerts a downward pressure. Ask taxi drivers in cities where Uber has been introduced. So the fact that after 2008 we didn't see any new banks and we didn't see any downward pressure on wages tells you all you need to know. But they've got very strong PR departments, and I think one thing is it's become complex. Not terribly, because it's ultimately about perverse incentives, and everybody understands perverse incentives. 7-year-old understands perverse incentives. But then politicians have to manage a lot of things. I mean, look at Europe. We have had Ukraine, and we've had the Euro mess with Greece. We've had terrorism. We have refugees. And so you have to have really smart people who take time out to weed through all the crap and all the deliberate obfuscation to get to the core. And that's really difficult. And then there also part of the financial press has been very good at, I think, sort of half-wittingly playing the business as usual game by not saying after 2008 we're going to do journalism completely different, because our old journalism allowed for this kind of thing to fester for all these years. They've basically gone back to, well, there was a whole new flood of numbers this morning, then there was interpretation of those numbers, then there was comment on those interpretations, we'll present them, yearly reports, quarterly reports, job, labor, all these numbers. And so I think as journalists, we also have to look in the mirror. Like, we're meant to be the watchdog. And I think very often we've been the lapdog.
Okay. Maybe not. So this Mossack Fonseca business, is that very unusual then in a journalistic point of view, basically?
Well, I think that there was everybody. I meet so many rich Dutch people who tell me, look, if I wanted to, I could have stopped paying taxes in Holland long ago. And so for them, paying tax becomes a lifestyle option.
Okay.
So that sort of makes them feel good about themselves.
Okay.
And if it no longer does make them feel good about themselves, they'll stop paying taxes in Holland. This has been going on for a long time. And then we go, well, it's legal. And we in journalism are about Watergate. We have to find illegal behavior that leads to the president having to resign. And this is legal, so it's not fun.
So we just leave it.
We find it extremely difficult, and this also accounts for many other big issues in our society, as journalists to write accessible stories about systems. We're very good at people. Sanders versus Clinton, very easy, very juicy, but systems, very hard. Climate change, you have to bring in the polar bear.
Okay, yeah. An animal, right, yes. Someone to focus on. But this all sounds very depressing. It sounds like,
it does.
The power is with the banks, the politicians, they want to work in the banks, so they don't do much. What's going to happen? How are we going to do it?
Yeah, I mean, the paradox, as Joris said, is like, we had to respond to the crisis with more rules for the banks, which makes it more difficult for new banks to come into the market.
Right.
Which really means the more the banks misbehave, the safer they are.
That's crazy.
So what's happened in the US? Well, the big banks have gotten much bigger. The system has gotten much more concentrated, also as a result of all the rules. So it's in a way much more fragile than it was in 2008. And I think it's interesting with banks is like, because you could maybe sort of say, well, this is a sort of a leftist view, or this is a ideology-based criticism, but that's not true. My experience is that the more you know about banks, the more critical you are. For example, we had the Occupy Wall Street movement a few years ago. And so a few years ago, the head of the financial stability in the Bank of England, Andrew Haldane, which was, he's responsible for monitoring London city banks, which is like monitoring the global system. He held a speech and said, well, this has been interesting because you've been right. Occupy Wall Street, you're right. And he would deliver criticism that's much more to the point, much more radical, in fact, than any European politician has ever said, because they don't understand how it works. And that's, I think, is in a way the scariest thing about it. And that's one of the scariest things in your book, that if you really get into the depth of it, that's when you get really scared and upset.
Yeah.
It's not about bonus, greed. It's much more complex than that.
I used to study the Middle East for many years. And as you learn more about the Middle East, you get more nuanced. And it becomes impossible, essentially, to make any statement about Arabs, Palestinians, Israelis, because it gets so colorful and 3D. With banks, I've gone through exactly the same sort of werdegang as Andreas. Where you begin to realize that actually nuances, they stop us from seeing the very big threat.
So it's the other way around, basically.
It's the other way around, yeah. And I think that the failure of the economics department is also glaring, especially the so-called top universities. It's interesting how the revolutionary stuff is not coming out of the so-called top universities. Piketty, David Graeber, those sort of people, they work in the so-called marginal universities, so to speak. And the economists, if you go to university and you want to know where the economics department is, what you do, you look at the cars. Because almost every economics professor has a nice little consultancy firm for the banks and for financial players, and his or her faculty salary is just an extra.
Interesting.
Then again, you have to look at the systems. Right now, universities have to produce a number of students who graduate, and then the more of those students make it into well-paying jobs, the higher the ranking. Here we go again, just like in finance, rankings, targets, the higher the ranking of the university. So on the one hand, we're really angry at the way economists have been and universities fail in their critical task. On the other hand, in the system we've adopted forces them to do so. And it's the same with the banks. They are listed on the stock exchange, and so their investors, your pension funds, your insurers, they push them to make more profit. Well, basically the way to make more profit is either take more risk or cheat people. Or, lower salaries. Well, I will leave some time for laughing now.
Lower salary is likely to happen. So should you just, as a private person, so should I just accept that the banks are what they are? They are evil. They will never change. The politicians won't make them change. But I can make a choice on my own. I can choose a bank or a delivery of financial services that is not one of the larger banks. I can choose a smaller one. Is that the way to do it then, to feel okay with yourself, or what should you do?
Yeah, well, it's difficult because your bankman is not evil, hopefully. I mean, I think 99% of people working in banks are just honorable, honest people. They don't make too much money, or just like any other worker. But they can be a sort of piece of a corrupted puzzle. For example, you said about your relationship to your banker. I mean, if you would go to the Volvo store, and he wouldn't call himself your personal car man.
No.
And when you ask, which car is right for me? Well, I think a Volvo might be right for you. But that's exactly what happens at a bank.
Yes.
You go in, you're your personal bankman. Well, I think our funds are pretty good.
Yes.
And these funds, as you have shown in your books,
yes.
can be bluff.
Yeah, terrible.
These are not good for the customers. These are actually ripping the customer off.
Right.
And the bankman probably knows that. And I don't think that makes that person feel too good. So in a way that makes them corrupt or hostage to a system that's not, So it's very difficult. But I think, I think the times we're living in, I mean, Nokia was a few years ago number one, dominant. But they're gone. Why? Because the customers didn't like their stuff.
No.
Okay, so if banks don't do stuff we don't like, I think over time they're going to be in trouble one way or another, because there can become new technology, something can happen, and then it can go very fast. You cannot go on ripping your customer off. It's not going to work.
But that's been so depressing, I find, is that at least in the Netherlands and the UK, I mean, hardly anybody switches. And I think there's this neoliberal calculation at the back of this where people go, well, if I'm the only one to switch, and it takes such a hassle to switch, nothing changes. And if lots and lots and lots of people switch, then it doesn't matter if I switch either.
No.
And so I think I'm struck by how many people resort to this sort of anti-collectivist thinking. It's like, okay, I want to feel good about myself, so I'm going to go to Handelsbank or Triodos or some sort of thing. And if the rest of the world goes to shit, oh well, that's too bad. I don't feel bad about it, and that's the final point of reference. How do I feel? And if you go back to big changes, for example, women's emancipation, yes, you can sort of decide for yourself not to discriminate against women, but you do want a society as a whole. And I think if those fighting for women's emancipation 100 years ago had waited for the majority to adopt the idea of the equality of gender, this room would just be full of stuffy men, and not just a podium.
No. So the fight... Yes, not just a podium. So there needs to be a fight.
Yeah, and I think two things. I think elite restraint. I think this has been generally overlooked also because we're so dominated by Anglo-Saxon thinking, and Anglo-Saxons really don't like this concept. But the idea that you just cannot leave it to a kind of free market of ideas, where sooner or later, if we've had enough scandals, the solution will present themselves. I think if elites on their own do not decide not to go for the full thing, but to see their role as CEO as a social role rather than as a prize that will bring status and money. And this, I was struck when interviewing people that they're very much like us three. We several languages, we've lived abroad for a while, we have many options, and they would go like, yeah, what do you expect me to do? I mean, I'm faced with these fantastic temptations, and no punishment here because what I do is legal, and it's happening everywhere. And I don't think these people are going to change. And society at large is just too uninterested. It's fantastic to have a few hundred people here. But by and large, I think so-called low information voters, they don't even know what the Panama Papers are. We cannot wait, I think, for the majority to turn. And you need elite restraint. And I was struck by...
What does that mean?
I think that for example, so many people I interviewed said, the question is always how do we gain the system within the rules? How do we sail as close as we can to the sea? Now that is not elite restraint. There are certain things that perhaps you could do according to the law, but you shouldn't. And I think that's gone totally out of the window. And I'm depressed also by how many emails I've gotten, because the book is now out across Europe, from people working in oil, tobacco, pharmacy, consumer goods, software, and they tell me, look, you're not doing financial anthropology. This is corporate anthropology. This mentality of within the rules, we're publicly listed, our shareholders demand profits within the law, that's what we'll deliver. And I think this model is doomed. It produces more and more crashes and scandals at shorter and shorter intervals.
So what do you think will happen?
I don't know. Usually human beings exhaust all the alternatives before doing the right thing. And with every new scandal, I go like, this must be it. And I'm sure there were points in the emancipation of women and also of gays when things look really bad. And often, just before things turn, they look the worst. So yeah, never underestimate both the ability of people to do something stupid, but also, over time, to do the right thing. We've come so far with the women's emancipation. That was so much harder than getting a few laws on the books that will reward people for doing things that are good for society. I mean, it's not rocket science.
So, Andreas, what we need is legislation, basically. Well, politicians.
One should remember also that why are we in this situation? Now, this is quite new. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, financial was heavily regulated. And I mean, if you in the beginning of the 80s, I mean, the high flyers, they would work at IBM. They wouldn't work at the bank, and they would make more money than a banker. A banker was a boring, risk avert person, going forth, in a boring office.
Very careful. Yeah,
then they deregulated the whole world financial system. Why? Because they thought more finance is more growth. It gets better for everyone. Well, maybe they should rethink that. So that the financial sector exploded, and then we had a lot of trouble. So one should remember that it was political decisions that sort of made this possible. I mean, for example, in Sweden, it was very strictly regulated how much the banks could borrow or could lend. In fact, I mean, it was almost a political decision.
Right.
Then in 1985, they took this, limit away. 5 years later, we had a crash. Only 5 years later. That tells you, and that was, same case in big parts of the world. So I mean, of course, you can if you can make the decision in the first place, you can reverse it. Of course, it becomes more difficult over time. Sure. And I think also one other thing to remember is what's happened also is that the shareholders have basically kidnapped the system. Because if you look at a bank, for example, the shareholders will maybe stand for 5% of the risks of the balance sheet. But the shareholders, they appoint the management. They take all the profits. And that's not
And the rest of the risk is the taxpayer.
Yeah, the taxpayer and the society. I mean,
Right.
and this is not a given. This is also quite new way. This used to be a sort of a stakeholder view that okay, you had the company, you had the employees, you had the society, and you had to sort of balance these interests. Now it's
Right.
only the shareholders, which is in fact quite a small group in the interest of a company.
But you really think that this Panama document thing is going to change the agenda for the banks?
I think it will if it's taken up in a really intelligent way by political groupings that manage to translate it into the kind of slogans that you need, that on the one hand deliver the message right to people's hearts, but do not veer too far away from actual truth to become ridiculous. And the temptation, I think, for politicians to appeal to low information voters by pretending the problem is evil bankers rather than evil banks is huge. And there's complicity. I mean, the people who still vote are pensioners. Well, it's their pension funds. And then there's the home-owning middle classes. I think if we would... There's this fantastic book by John Kay, which is called Other People's Money. And he lays out just how far financialization has gone, that only 3% of all currency trading currently in the world is for the real economy. So a Swedish krona moves 33 times before it reaches its destination. And all these people take a cut. And the same with home prices. Because the banks could create so much credit, they managed to make those prices go up. And my experience when I give talks across Europe, and as the talk progresses, people get suitably angry and more angry. And then I say, okay, so if we, change course, home prices will, I think, go down by between 50 and 70%. This is the point at which support in the audience for far-reaching measures collapses. And it's only young students who are still in favor. And so don't underestimate the degree of complicity. A lot of home-owning people consider the value of their home as their own. Right. It was pure luck. It was pure luck. And for many years, they've made their capital gains from labor were far lower than from the increase in value of their homes.
But we know what you're talking about in Sweden. It's gone crazy.
Yeah, and so I think that this is where intellectuals must really step in, because we've initially.
But basically, don't touch our value on our houses.
Yeah.
That's what you want, really, isn't it?
But this is the big problem, and I think to admit to yourself that you bought a house that you will never be able to pay back, nor that you can sell because it's now gone down in value so much. That's a big thing, especially for people who've spent so many dinner parties bragging about how clever they were and that they paid a little less interest. I rent, so I can still do this.
Now you tell us.
Yes, now you tell us. All right. But you actually met a lot of these people that work in the business.
Yeah, so around 200, and some of them were actually involved. And they would talk. They would have this vocabulary that was stripped of all possibilities of an ethical dialogue. So they would talk about proposing tax-efficient solutions. That was the Panama Papers.
Okay.
Or tax optimization.
And do they make a lot of money out of this?
Some. They start with. So there's the front office. They're the actual bankers. They are like the athletes. But then 90% are support and controls, and they don't make that much at all. But then the front office they do, but it's only the top. And so, and the top is they start with 100, and maybe 3 make it into so-called managing directors by the time they're our age, and then they will be making over $1 million. And they're very unlikely to pay taxes, because if your bank offers these tax-efficient solutions, why not use them? But it's actually the number of people taking home telephone number bonuses is quite low. Journalists, we tend to focus on them, and in January, when it's bonus season, it's always the only time the BBC is interested in my book, because bonuses have come out, and we're all going to be angry. But it's a tiny group, but they do make a bit more, and some of them quite a lot more. And in UK you have private schools, so it's if you leave finance, you have to probably take them out of private schools, and even more insane housing bubble than here in Amsterdam. But they were it's what I found so surprising is just how similar they are to most people here. I mean, you are interested in the world, you can follow discussion in English. That already puts you in a sort of 2-3% of the sort of European elite. And they are the smartest, most analytical terms, and most ambitious of those. And yeah, so they're not evil. Some of them are evil. Journalism also has its evil people.
Andreas?
I think, I mean, if you look at what the bank's been doing, it seems like they have their strategy is like, it's only a problem if you get caught with something. Not actually doing it. That's not even a question.
Yeah.
If you
reputation risk.
Exactly, it's called reputation risk. That's rewriting for moral. But so if you can do it, you do it. But what's new actually is that you can get caught.
Yeah.
That's what the Panama shows us. In the era of digital, you can get caught. And I think when also Volkswagen, I mean, and I think that's going to, possibly change something. I think a lot of banks been quite busy the last few weeks, checking out their offshore
I thought
industry.
It was quite obvious looking at the Nordea press conference the other week that they had never expected to have to answer these questions. About the Panama, their customers and these accounts and these brevlådeföretag.
Well, it was quite interesting because they were asked. So
don't know what it is.
Yeah. So one of the stories was they lent several billion to a real estate oligarch close to the dictator in
Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan, exactly. So the question was, do you know who you lend money to?
Right.
Well, we always check out our clients, Okay, so you knew that you lent money to this guy. Well, we can't comment on specific clients. And it was like, if you lend money, would that have been okay?
Yes.
Well, the impression was they didn't even understand the question.
No.
Why shouldn't they lend this guy money?
If we can.
Yeah. And we've had in Holland really a mirror image of this a year ago when the bonus regulation cap, the EU bonus cap came in, and so ABN AMRO they lost their bonuses, and so they took part of that bonus and added it to their salary. Which didn't go down very well because ABN AMRO is the worst disaster in modern capitalism. It was still in the hands of the Dutch government. It cost the Dutch taxpayer about 15 billion and would have cost them 30 billion if we hadn't managed to sell some of ABN AMRO to the Brits a few years earlier. Yes, I love giving talks in England, and I said I'd like to start out with a word of thanks on behalf of all the Dutch taxpayers. Thank you for buying ABN AMRO. So they actually, in a time when they were laying off people, they raised their own salaries. And they had announced this in advance, they'd gone through all the paperwork, they had permission from the minister, and then society exploded. It was a year ago. And they were just as surprised as here. And they were struggling as badly in understanding, as you said, the question as here. And I think what that also points to is the bubble these people live in. By the time you are an executive anywhere in the corporate world, you live a life that has almost no connection with the life of normal people. So I believe them when they say that they're surprised by all the outrage, because the people they surround them with, they also use these tax-efficient solutions. They live in a bubble where they're surrounded by maybe PR people as well as equals, and the rest all suck up to them. They come to the university and it's full of these nice masters of business administration students who all think, some exposure to a CEO. They live the sort of the glamorous life where they have, I think, very little exposure to ordinary people and how they live. And indeed, it's very difficult. Quite a lot of Europeans, I mean, hundreds of millions of Europeans live off maybe have a disposable income of maybe 500-600 euros a month after all their costs. Well, that kind of life has almost nothing in common with somebody who spends that on a dinner.
So they're truly surprised by the reaction of ordinary people.
Yeah.
So, but just let me get back to this question about, so do you really think that we are going into a phase of change now? That the banks will be forced to change because they won't on their own?
Well, I think what's happened, I mean, because to save all these, people and all the mistakes they made, and the system, you had to go to extremes. The central banks, we have negative rates, unprecedented stimulus, and it's created a whole new set of problems, a whole new set of even bigger problems, and the problems have spread to China, to Brazil, and and that's going to probably end sooner or later in some sort of crash, probably, or some sort of backlash, and then you're going to have another, round of criticism, and that could be much tougher. And then that could open for more radical solutions.
Okay.
But I don't think. But I'm pessimistic about the politicians, dealing with it. Of the reasons because there is part of the same.
And they're dependent
elites.
on the financial sector,
on the financial
aren't
sector.
they?
I think less so in continental Europe. I mean, this sort of campaign finance, which if in Africa or in South America or in Asia, you give money to a politician who then does what you want him to do, we have a different word for it. We don't call it campaign finance. It starts with a C. And,
Right.
but we don't have that in continental Europe. And in some continental European countries, you don't even have second careers. In Belgium, no politician goes to work for the banks. And still, there, the banks run the show. So it seems that their power goes back to a deeper source. Generally, I think intellectually, really the first step, but it's the most complicated one, is that the word growth. The word growth initially was developed because people worked out that if you have a factory and you put in this amount of labor and this amount of you have technology and then raw materials, and every hour you get 100 loaves of bread. Now you do something clever, you change not the input, still the same amount of input, but you organize the production process more cleverly, you get 110 loaves of bread. Now, you used to have 100, now 110. We need a word for it, let's call it growth. It's an increase in productivity. Now, over time, growth can now also mean not producing more with the same input, but creating money out of nowhere, spending it on consumption, and then that activity is suddenly also called growth. And so we add it to our gross national product, and then when we look at how much money we borrowed, we say that's fine because relative to GDP, it's still very healthy. So borrowing finds its way into our GDP numbers and then justifies retroactively all the borrowing. Now I think as long as we conflate real growth with paper growth, it will be extremely tempting for politicians in a democratic system to win the next election simply by inflating. And indeed, if you look at the criticism of the bank, very often is you're not lending enough. I mean,
Yes?
Yeah, and the problem is you lend too much, and then, can you lend some more, borrow more? And that's the whole problem. But I think you touched on a very important point that the whole system is now basically anchored on real estate prices. Yeah. It used to be gold, but in effect, it's anchored to real estate. And that touches the lives of so many people. So that makes it much harder to because all the lending, I mean, in Sweden, all the lending that's going on, it's connected to prices of real estate going up. I mean, and it's also so deep in our psychology. Like, for example, you can read, in a newspaper about, how to make a real estate career, meaning, buying, selling for a higher price, buying again, selling. I mean, you wouldn't read like how to make a stock career, because stock prices, everybody knows that stock goes like this, but real estate, it's like, well, it can only go up.
And imagine that the news would say, good news about the bread market. Bread has never been as expensive as it is now.
Yeah, exactly.
But all those home-owning journalists, they go like, the good news about the housing market.
But do you think that for the banks to change, we need a crash in house prices?
The banks are part of a much wider problem. They're, I think, the most visible part. They've also sort of, taken on that role almost. But I think as long as these wider questions aren't addressed, then it's basically futile to try to change the banks. The banks operate in a much more complex environment. And of course, I find this problem as a journalist, if you try to analyze systems, it seems like the story sort of disappears. You say, he's to blame, she's to blame, that, central bank, credit rating agencies, consultancies, accountants, banks. People go like, I want a villain. And then we're going to chase the villain from the village and we'll feel better. And this is where it seems that as human beings, we've built these systems that we can no longer capture in a story. And since we communicate as human beings in stories, it's very difficult to then change that system because we have to appeal to people's understanding, but without using a story.
And then so few people understand the system.
We're the only three, actually.
Yeah, actually. and that's why we're going to be very, very rich.
Right.
No, but I mean, how many in Europe can explain the OTC, market for options and credit default swaps, clearinghouses, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not too many. And the people who do know it, they don't work at the financial authority.
No.
The smartest people. So that's a problem, I think. Yeah. But also one problem is, of course, that all the people that made mistakes. Okay, so they, like in the U.S., they were greedy. They made mistakes. They knew they were making mistakes. They spent all the shareholders' money, and what happened? Well, they now spending the shareholders' money to pay fines for what they did, which is crazy. And not a single. I mean, if you look at the high-ranking banking officials in the U.S., no one has been prosecuted. No one has, suffered any consequences economically. It would be very different if they. Okay, you fined $50 billion. Well, we'll spread it out around the table. So you, Stephen, your share is $5 billion. Can you please pay it tomorrow?
This happened in France because there are all these different scandals. So you constantly have to move from one scandal to the next. But they're so-called rogue traders, and and individuals can lose insane amounts of money. And usually, what you're meant to have in banks is risk limit. So if people lose more than a certain number, alarm bells go off. But some of these traders, they are so expert in the IT system, they can hide their losses for a very long time, take more risk in order to recoup the losses. Often that works, we don't hear from it. Often it doesn't work. Sometimes it doesn't work. So there was this guy, Jérôme Kerviel at Société Générale, and he lost 4.9 billion euros. And that's a lot of money. And Société Générale was not amused. And two things happened. One is that none of his bosses were prosecuted at all. It was suddenly he became this sort of rogue element.
Right.
The word rogue trader is already embedded in the language because they're constantly encouraged to make as much money as they can. But if they fail, and then they're isolated, they're on their own. But then Société Générale got a French court to fine Jérôme Kerviel 4.9 billion euros. And so it was now overturned. But initially, it looked like Jérôme Kerviel would spend the rest of his life in social.
But that's the trader.
Yeah, social housing. And whatever he made at his next job, he was a software. It would be capped at the social minimum, and everything else went to Société Générale. Now, imagine that you would just take the banks here that were saved, take that amount of money, divide it by the top 1,000 people, and say, yeah, this is your fine. And so you would have all these top people now living in social housing until they paid it back. I mean,
interesting thought.
It would bring a completely different temperament of personality of people to these banks, more a civil service temperament. And I think that's the temperament you want in an organization that can create money out of nothing.
Okay. I think we'll open for questions. I think it's about time. Yes? How about that?
Yeah.
Are there any questions? In the green shirt there. Is there a microphone? Just wait for the microphone.
Thanks for a great panel. Do you think there's any risk or possibility for us of banks being disrupted in the same way that taxis have been disrupted by Uber or hotels by Airbnb, that we simply just bypass the bank system?
Who picks it up?
Well, I think so. I mean, and it's quite interesting when Bitcoin came on the stage a few years ago, and the CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, said, well, this is very dangerous stuff. This is, you can't be dealing with this. And, a few months later, JP Morgan, spent hundreds of millions of dollars into the technology around Bitcoin. So, I mean, and all the big banks in the world are doing it right now. So, sure, I think that's what I meant about if you're screwing off your customer, sooner or later you could be disrupted. It's not for sure, but there's a big risk, and that it could be Bitcoin, could be something else, and I mean it tells you, like in the era we live in now, should it take like 2 days to transfer money? I mean, it still does. When transfer money to my parents used to live in France, it take 2 days. Or at least we have our routines, Okay, so it takes a thousandth of a second in the real world.
Right.
But what do you do between that
Where does
and
it
2
go?
days? What are the routines? So.
It would be very depressing if, as democracies, we fail to solve this and we sort of escape by a techno fix.
So, but you don't think that there's this new bank with a new technical idea or techniques that will just, you know, pick the raisins, so to speak, out of the.
But it's already happening. I mean, there are a lot of thousands of companies started around financial technology, and the banks are very much aware of this and spending huge sums to sort of try to catch up.
You could argue that Swish, you know, this very popular transfer service that you can use your mobile phones in Sweden, you can just send money to your friend, basically, using a mobile phone number. But this is the aim of this is just to stop other companies from moving into banking areas, to stop competition, basically.
Yeah, sure. That's what we're going to try to do, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. But I agree. I mean, it would be nicer if we solved this in a democratic way. But
Yes. Are there any more questions? Yes, here, please.
I would like to know if you could tell me 3 things that I can do tonight as I leave this room, that I, as a private little person that does not control the system or has any personal influence of it at all, what can I do? 3 things that would actually make a difference.
I think write your pension fund. Write to your pension fund that you're not uniquely interested in yields and returns, and that you want to have an overview of where they're putting their money. 2 is don't vote for the sort of parties who brought you this system, and 3 is get your money out of the system. That there are smaller banks. On the other hand, there's a Dutch bank, Triodos, which is really set up very differently with certificate holders rather than shareholders, and they can't push Triodos to do risky stuff. But they struggle with absorbing all the extra funds that are coming their way. And that they're having to hire people from the old banks, but in order to decompress and detoxify these people, so they stop thinking the way they've been taught to think, takes so long. And I think to talk to others about this, that's also I think neglected. And it's interesting how I think from the 90s onward there was this understanding that politics from now on is show business for ugly people. So all we want to know is who's up and who's down, who's popular, who's not, horse race. And I think this is the next step is to politicize again and to get used again to real hard political conflict, because we're not going to put this right without it.
Yeah, I think Nordea has. Yeah. I think Nordea has something like 11 million customers. So if they received 11 million emails saying, "Could I please get my money back?" I think they would take it seriously, not only say they take it seriously.
So you can actually communicate with your bank?
Yeah, I think you can communicate with your bank, your politicians, and absolutely, and start with your bank, because they're very sensitive. You can go out in social media. Their companies are much more sensitive to this than I think we are aware of. I mean, and today, if someone retweets a couple of hundred tweets, that's a Twitter storm. Imagine if you have 100,000 tweets, or Facebook, or they'd be shaking.
But if you want a bank that do things differently, is there one?
Well, there are smaller players. I mean, you can look at the there are measurements of how pleased customers different banks have. If you look at that, you see that on the scale of more pleased customers, there are the small, niche players.
Right.
You could always look at that, but I mean, there are options out there.
Well, the fact that most of us are paying into a pension fund, and that pension fund is making far-reaching decisions, and it's you can demand to see where they're putting their money, and also alert them to the fact that when they tell each other, well, our clients are only interested in return, that they're wrong. And I mean, I think with climate change already, this is happening where there's real and directed pressure at pension funds to divest from fossil fuels. And we've seen with South Africa, the veterans among us, that it worked in South Africa. That's money is a very powerful thing. In the Financial Times today, there was a really quite terrible and cynical article about how now agricultural firms are pushed into using less antibiotics, and the reason is that their investors are also invested in insurers and in a number of other sectors that will suffer if the use of antibiotics leads to a big pandemonium. So it's follow the money. And there's this beautiful saying from an LSE lawyer, London School of Economics, that the 20th century was about organizing labor, unions, the welfare state. The 21st century is about organizing capital. And we are complicit, but we also have far more influence than we think through our insurers and pension funds and the banks we use.
Det kan man bara säga, det Joris pratar om är då framförallt tjänstepensionen som arbetsgivaren betalar in. De hamnar ju hos en pensionsförvaltare. Då kan man ju faktiskt ställa frågor till den förvaltaren. Var finns mina pengar? Och finns de inte där man tycker att det är bra, etiskt eller så vidare, så kan man ju flytta på dem. Här borta.
Hi, thanks for a great discussion tonight. You spoke early on about politicians going to the dark side or lobbyists. Is there any way of putting a number of their influence in, say, Brussels, and or should their influence be contained in some way, regulated? Thank you.
I think just a simple demand or a question in the next television debate before an election across Europe is just you have all these politicians who want to be prime minister. Do you guarantee that your minister of finance will never accept a job in the financial sector after he's done? I think it will be revealing. And it's very easy.
So, I mean, we had a prime minister and a financial minister, two ministers responsible for banks. So the prime minister is working for Merrill Lynch, finance minister is working for Citigroup, the responsible for the banks working for Swedbank, and and the former minister for finance used to work for the bank lobby. So.
And I think the gloves have to come up on this one. I find when it's the only time that I get real pushback in Holland and ugly pieces and character assassinations when I begin to name names. I said that captain of industry is that royal advisor is the national advisor for Goldman Sachs. Because what these big American banks and also the biggest banks do is that in every European country they have one very prominent insider who advises them and basically keeps them clued in on where the country is going, where the big deals are happening. And these are they're usually, for example, former heads of the business lobby. They've been active, if you have corporatist structures where business lobby and the labor movement work together, they've been very active there. And I think we should really put their photographs in the newspaper and just point out, look, this is the degree to which our own establishment is in bed with global finance. And then you'll find that all the nice little sort of, hey, Andreas, how are you doing? Are you thinking about a job after this one? They stop. As in, right now, I'm already persona non grata in a lot of places, and I'm being told in Holland, yeah, but I mean, you've become an unacceptable person.
Because you've exposed these people?
On TV, what I've done is I've taken photographs of them and hanged them all on a wall. And just said, this one works there, this one works there.
That's not
the Dutch way. No, abstractions are fine.
Okay. But what happens to these people afterwards when you've exposed them?
Nothing. The thing is also that it's now, essentially, I think politics these days is no longer between left and right. There's a post-ideological establishment, and then there's fringes. And the post-ideological establishment is essentially where you're a politician for a while, and then you move on to your next challenge. And your next challenge is probably going to be in the corporate world. And that's one group. And so indeed, this is how you recognize the fringe. They are the ones who will never be asked to become an advisor. And yeah, so if you, as a journalist, it's difficult because you as for your sources and your acceptability and your access, you really don't want to be seen as part of the fringe, also because that's also where the racists are and the nutcases and the swivel-eyed loons, as they call them in England. But yet, among those swivel-eyed loons, they're also the only ones who see it straight, also because they have no interest in the status quo.
Hi. I was struck by the fact that you continued to use this example of women's liberation and gay liberation, and those are human rights discourses. But one word we have not heard tonight is poverty. And poverty kills, and poverty is often racialized. And I'm interested that hasn't come up at all. And if you want to evoke this human rights discourse, why does that not have any place in the room?
I think it did come up a little bit with the organization of labor, with the welfare state. And I think it's actually a really good analogy because poverty is so much more complex to address compared to women's liberation, which is also quite legal. And as for women's liberation, it was really interesting. About a third of my interviewees in London were women, and all of them said that they got far more flack in society for being a banker than in the bank for being a woman. And so right now these clear divides have clearly collapsed, and class and gender intersect. But poverty is extreme. There's also this strange complicity where if you may be poor in the West, but actually in a global perspective, you're still part of the 20%, and you're benefiting mightily from the current financial system. The fact that when we go to Morocco and we buy their products, I pay in euro, we pay in euros. We just print these euros out of nothing. If the Moroccans do the same thing, the value of their currency collapses. Now that is truly oppression, because we can just basically create the money out of nothing to pay for their products. And so poor people here also really benefit. I think if we would go to a fair global system, the poor here would get poorer.
Okay, I want to thank you all for coming here this evening, listening to this discussion about the banking sector. I hope you had a nice time and that you got answers to the questions that you had. Okay, well, thank you, Andreas Cervenka and Joris Leijenburg.
Thank you so much, Andreas.